However, it is much like when we went from chapter 21 into chapter 22. It's really the last verse of the previous chapter going in to the beginning verse. So we will start this morning by going back to verse 30 of chapter 22. But on the next day, wishing to know for certain why he'd been accused by the Jews, he released him and ordered the chief priest and all the council to assemble and brought Paul down and set him before them. So you remember, of course, that Lysias, the commander of the garrison there in Jerusalem, has been trying to deal with the Paul situation for a while now, and he's tried multiple things here. And so, as we ended last week looking at Paul revealing his Roman citizenship and the conversations that followed that, here the following day, Lysias is going to sit him down with the Sanhedrin and try and resolve this situation because remember right now he still doesn't even have an official charge against Paul. One geographical note, because some people really get interested in this aspect of it, but I don't know for certain where this meeting is being held. I suspect that it is right there in the courtyard of the Gentiles from the language where he brought Paul down like that. I think it would have been in the fortress and took him back down there and set it up there, but I don't know. Some people see it somewhere else or somewhere else in the temple, and it could be. But as we move into chapter 23, officially there, Paul, looking intently at the council, said, Brethren, I have lived my life with a perfectly good conscience before God up to this day. The high priest Ananias commanded those standing beside him to strike him on the mouth. Then Paul said to him, God is going to strike you, you whitewashed wall. Do you sit to try me according to the law, and in violation of the law order me to be struck? But the bystander said, Do you revile God's high priest? And Paul said, I was not aware, brethren, that was high priest, for it is written, You shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people. So, what is the first line of defense that Paul introduces here for himself?
He's lived in all good conscience before God. I'm innocent.
Okay. So his first line of defense is the testimony of his own conscience. And he says, and remember, he talked in his last speech to them about his history of going from Saul the persecutor to Paul the apostle. And so now they will say that both pre conversion as well as up to that very moment he is talking to, he has lived in all good conscience before God. So he has always been doing what he believed God wanted him to do. What do you think of this defense?
It's truthful.
Truthful? I start out with a heart. Okay. Well, I guess I'll go on to move on to the next one then. What does Ananias think of it? So that question was what you think of it is. But Ananias did not think anything positive about it at all, did he? How do we know that? Yeah. Oh, he just gave testimony I don't like. Somebody slapping me. Let's get that money.
Actually, the Greek word there is a little bit stronger than just a slap in the face.
Tell us about it.
The Greek word is mainly means to inflict a blow. So it wasn't probably merely a slap. He probably actually punched in the mouth. More than likely to get him to shut up because he didn't like what he had to say.
Doesn't think very much of that line of defense.
It's the same word that's used whenever Jesus is beaten with the reeds in the head. Before the crucifixion. That's a guy. they meant to do some serious damage to them too.
What did Paul, why did Paul rather begin his defense this way? It is a thinking question, but we're 4 or 5 questions in right now, guys. You should be warmed up.
Because even though he was against them at first, he believed that he was doing correct. And then when he became a Christian, he continued to follow Jesus' commands.
It gives him the basis here, as Patty was saying, to build a defense and at the same time to preach basically that, uh, you know, he was living in all good conscience, just like
They were.
they were when he was persecuting the church. But he learned his error and he changed and was still, as a Christian, as a servant of Christ, able to live in good conscience. So it sets up not only a defense of the of a good conscience, if you will, but most of all, it sets up a foundation to later be able to say, uh, if you're truly following God, then you should recognize that Jesus is his son, the Messiah, as well. And you should, if you're going to keep a good conscience, do what?
Change.
You should change. So you can see where he hopes to go here. What popular religious misconception does Paul's clear conscience disprove?
Your conscience shouldn't be your sole guide.
You know, uh, we we have a tendency, no matter what our belief system is or bearing, to live according to our conscience. And while there's a good things to do about that, with that, it is also very dangerous. It is very much like I'm wearing my wristwatch this morning. It is very much like if when I go to set the time on this and my battery's gone dead, I had to get a new battery in there. And when I go to set the time again, I don't consult any credible source for the time or anything. I just say, well, feels like it's about noon, and I set it at noon. And then if for the rest of that battery's life, I go by what my watch says, I may be acting in all good conscience, in other words, but I set my watch wrong to start with. So you can set your conscience wrong. Your conscience can be taught wrong. And so sometimes it is extremely necessary to go by your conscience. And most of all, and this is the heart of that misconception I'm looking for, what does our culture tell people about religion? Well, it tells us that as long as you believe what you're doing, you're good. And yet, this is a direct contradiction of that popular philosophy. That as long as I believe it, I'm good. No, what matters is the truth. Monty, do you have a comment?
Well, it'll go lining out with what you're saying here. Our conscience does not set the standard, but it applies the standard according to the perception that we have of a set of morality. I'll give an example. You take a thief, he's going to be his conscience is going to be considered guilty to him if he rats on a fellow through. Just like ours is going to be guilty if we lie about a friend or something. And so our conscience doesn't set the standard, it just applies it. You can be sincere in what you believe. Paul was sincere in what he believed. And so he could live up with a good conscience because he was sincere in it. But at the same time, be sincerely wrong.
Okay.
He was sincerely wrong. And persecuted Christians whenever he did it. He did it with a good conscience.
All right, let's look at verse 3 again, because this next question is specifically about that. why does Paul respond the way he does there in verse 3? That's when he immediately speaks out against the high priest.
Put on the outside, but inside are dead man bones.
Is that why he responds that way?
He was struck in the mouth.
Okay.
Here's a man being judged and they haven't heard a word he said and they just go ahead and slap him.
Okay.
It's an injustice.
Paul doesn't even officially have a charge against him, much less is he a convicted criminal. It was against the law to strike him. It was against the Jewish law to strike him because he was untried. And so you have the height of hypocrisy. And that here is the high priest of the Sanhedrin, theoretically, then the most moral group, the most godly group in the world. And you have him trying to conduct a trial on Paul against the law, and then ordering him to be hit against the law. And yet, all he keeps saying, or any of them, as far as Paul's guilt is, he violates the law. So Paul is understandably saying that you're doing the very thing you're accusing me of. That's what he's doing here. I will say a word because I don't think even way back in introduction to class, I don't think I talked about Ananias, but Ananias, you got to realize that this whole period is getting very close now to the destruction of Jerusalem. So there are a number of different histories that we have. Besides the biblical account about these characters, and Ananias was a high priest. He ruled for several years, but he was very much a corrupt politician. He was known for his extreme cruelty, especially to his own Jews. He supported the Romans. He talked out of both sides of his mouth, we would say all the time. He was known for giving large bribes to people in both groups, depending on the situation and what he needed. But he was so hated by the Jewish people as a whole that there is a well-known parody of one of the songs that they would mock him with in his day. I won't bring it across to you because, frankly, it doesn't translate very well in English because it's wordplay. You just don't get it. But it was because he was known to take from the offering for himself and to do all kinds of physical abuse against other people and everything. As we're getting close here to AD 17, it's interesting to note that when that war starts, one of the first actions the Jewish people take is they go hunt him down and kill him. So he's an interesting historical figure. I always liked it because he flees to Herod's palace there in Jerusalem when they're hunting him. And then they find him and his brother basically hiding in a sewer line and kill both of them there. But that's his own people that do that. So that'll tell you a lot about what this kind of guy is. All right. We know then that, of course, the person who struck him said, "Hey, you're blaspheming or you're speaking against the high priest here." So what did you think of his statement, Paul's statement there in verse 5 when he hears this? And I don't know that there is a particularly wrong answer here, by the way. I put at least 4, maybe 5 possible ways you could take this. The problem comes up, or the concern comes up simply because at face value, you say you have Paul violating the law himself here because he did just speak against the high priest. So
He didn't even know who the high priest was.
He possibly doesn't know, literally doesn't know that that's the high priest. Would not be the same high priest he had dealt with, because remember, a lot of time has gone by now. Twain?
I'm surprised that he would not have been able to identify by clothing. So they were big into how they dressed, identifying themselves, just like a judge's robe or something. That he wouldn't be able to make that out.
And that fact is one of the big reasons why people go looking for another interpretation, and you wind up with several of them, because a lot of people assume he should have been able to recognize him from the dress. I would say against that, and again, no idea. But it is not an official Sanhedrin trial. This is a council that was called by Lysias, and that he is the one overseeing, not type. So maybe he's not. And this is just what those who would choose a different interpretation would say, but they'd say maybe he's not because of that fact. Any other interpretations?
There's a bunch of different things. But there's some commentators say that Paul, during his conversion, experience on the road to Damascus with a bright light, that his eyes were damaged. There are several passages where Paul talks about his eyesight, and they say, well, maybe, with damaged eyes, he couldn't see, but the most likely thing I think you're hitting on is that this wasn't just a court setting. And that high priest could have been out anywhere out in the midst of the crowd, and Paul might not have even recognized, who had said that.
Yeah. And of course, the eyesight theory bars a lot on the belief that that was of some people, that was just thorn in the flesh and everything. So that's I would say very circumstantial evidence, but it is some evidence. I've always thought that if I were bothering to defend one, which I don't, because again, I don't know which one is right. That if I was defending the eyesight one, I would say, hey, this guy was just beat mostly to death. Maybe his eyes are swelled up and everything, and he can't see very good. So that could be one of them. Anybody else want to try, Barbara?
I was just thinking if this high priest knew what was right and what was wrong according to his law, and he didn't want to look like the high priest because he knew he was doing wrong by slapping him and talking bad about him and all without a trial.
Well, I would argue against that one, that every Jew there would have known who he was, and they took great pride in wearing those distinguishing marks. Nick?
I always wondered if he was referring to Christ being the high priest, like in a slight kind of way. I don't know.
That could be it. Let me just list all the ones together. First off, is an ironic statement, and that comment, fits into that one well. But it could have been that. Again, we don't have the tone of voice. Sort of going. It could be a sincere apology, because we don't have the tone of voice. We don't know. He may be sincerely saying, I didn't recognize, and that's why I did that. It could be that he was unaware that the high priesthood had changed. Remember, he's not practicing Judaism more. He's been traveling the world, and they weren't keeping up on the internet or anything. So he might not. All of those different circumstances around the fact that Lysias is running the show and it's not actually the Sanhedrin could be one. I like number 5. I would combine it with Nick's thought there, and that is simply that because Ananias, as they usually did, came about to be high priest by illegal means, Paul would not even recognize him as actually being the high priest. And when you reinforce that with the foundational thought that Jesus is the high priest, You can see that a little bit more, but I don't know. I put all those out there for you just because I wanted you to see how you get these passages where there are a lot of different possible interpretations. You can't say which is right or wrong, but how they're always involved something like this that in the end matters how much. Yeah, it just doesn't have any effect on our salvation or anyone else's that we understand what Paul's motives were there. All right, let's look at the immediate following aftermath of those. But perceiving that one group were Sadducees and the other Pharisees, Paul began crying out in the council, Brethren, I am a Pharisee, a son of Pharisees. I am on trial for the hope and the resurrection of the dead. As he said this, there occurred a dissension between the Pharisees and Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. For the Sadducees say that there is no resurrection, nor angel, nor spirit, but the Pharisees acknowledge them all. I've always appreciated Luke's wording on that last one. You see the way he says the Pharisees acknowledge them all. He makes it, unquestionable, as of course it is due to Revelation, that these things do exist. Uh, but the Sadducees deny, the Pharisees simply acknowledge what is the reality. Uh, so going into that, what did Paul perceive about the group? It was a divide. He perceived that there was a division there because they were partly Pharisees, partly Sadducees. If you remember when I talked about the organization of the Sanhedrin and how you had the same numbers from the different groups. So you had, remember, Pharisee and Sadducee is a party affiliation and not the Sanhedrin title. But in the Sanhedrin, you had the group, the elders; those were respected Jews. You had the priests; those were the rulers of the 24 courses of priest. You had all these sections. You had the scribes. Uh, the scribes were mostly Pharisees, but remember I mentioned once before that they didn't have to be and weren't always Pharisee. So they're their own section. So when Paul looks out, he realizes there's a pretty good distribution here between Pharisees and Sadducees as far as party affiliation goes. And so he immediately moves into this. What is the gist of the cry? Yeah. He's letting that group know, the Pharisees, that he is one of them. Okay? Let's see how I worded that next question. All right, that worked. Why does he make this move, which I think, if you understand all the circumstances, you have to agree is a desperate move?
He wasn't going to get a fair trial any way it went. So I think he's just injecting something, say, hey, this is my way out of this whole mess.
As soon, and remember, Paul's in this mess in the first place due to his own determination that he could do so much to convert Jews. And so he keeps trying to go back to that. So you remember previously he had asked to be able to address that crowd and everything. He still got that same mentality. As soon as that opening scene took place, and he is hit for just daring to open his defense, saying, I've lived in a good conscience, he knows immediately he is not by any measure going to get anything like a fair trial here. And so he uses some wisdom here to put a good portion of the council, and probably the greater portion, the larger group here would be Pharisees in their party affiliation. But he knows he can't rely on a trial now. Why is verse 8 included? Verse 8, for the Sadducees say there is no resurrection, nor an angel, nor a spirit, but the Pharisees acknowledge them all. Ah. This is where again you see that this is the text that is written to the Gentile church. He didn't have to tell a Jew these things. A Jew grew up knowing these things very well. Yeah. Just like you could tell me, regardless of your own party affiliation, you could tell me the basics of the other major party affiliation. You know, he puts this in there because his audience is going to be mainly Gentile and wouldn't know this. I don't know how many times I've mentioned this in a lesson or a sermon places, and people come up to me afterwards and say, I never knew that. But it's very, very real.
You know, the thing that kind of strikes me is that the Sanhedrin, or the great Supreme Court, you might say, and out of that group, you know, though there were Sadducees who said there's no resurrection, there's no angels, there's no spirits, and yet they represented the spiritual side of the house. You know, they were basically the materialists. They believe that when you died, you're just like the dog rover. You're just dead all over. There isn't anything else. But that's the religious body. You know, isn't that ironic? It's ironic to me.
It shows you how far we can go and still consider ourselves to be, in our case, as Christian. But it's just like you hear me talk about these commentators who deny every other word of the Bible and yet claim they are Christian commentators. Yeah, I never understood that as well. Was Paul wrong to employ this tactic?
No.
I put that in there because a lot of commentators will tell you absolutely, but no, I won't say that it's inspired, but it may be as inspired, but it is clever and it was necessary because if he plays this out, they're going to convict him. And then Lysias is going to have to step back and say, well, they handled their business here and whatever. So it was a necessary thing. All right, let's look at verse 9 and following. And there occurred a great uproar, and some of the scribes of the Pharisaic party. So you see what I was just telling you earlier. The scribe probably is going to be a Pharisee, but not necessarily. So when you're trying to identify, you got to get both labels. They're a scribe by trade. They're a Pharisee by political affiliation. So they stood up and began to argue heatedly, saying, we find nothing wrong with this man. Suppose a spirit or an angel has spoken to him. And a great dissension was developing. That's an understatement, by the way, as you'll see in a minute. The commander was afraid Paul would be torn to pieces by them and ordered the troops to go down and take him away from them by force and bring him into the barracks. So, how did the Pharisees respond to Paul's statement?
They found nothing.
They hadn't bothered over that, didn't they? Yeah, they got emotionally involved in the situation at this time. Why did they respond this way?
Defending their own interests.
Yeah, he said. I always use the example because I grew up in the South. But when you're a fan of a certain football team, you can get off on the wrong foot with somebody right at the start, and then find out they're also a fan of the same team, and all of a sudden you're best friends. If you've ever gone to a road trip of your team, you've experienced that. You see these people are sitting around a group that is rooting for your team, and all of a sudden you guys are tight. That's the circumstance that Paul is playing on here, and that's why it works so well. Because all of a sudden, Paul has now put the attempts against him in light of being attempts against the doctrine of a resurrection. So, what demonstrates how great the dissension did become here? Remember, I said it's an understatement.
They are immediately.
What was I didn't hear all?
They are immediately.
Okay.
Argument is very good. It's like there was some three uproar. It wasn't just a discussion.
Yeah, Cynthia.
They're gonna take him and bring him to the barracks for
Yeah.
safety.
All of these things are true, but to me, the greatest one is that last one.
Yeah.
That the commander observing this going on is instantly afraid they're going to kill Paul before he can even get to Paul. And so he rushes the soldiers down there because he thinks Paul is literally, and he's probably right, being in danger of being torn to pieces. So, how do you think our commander feels now?
He's afraid. He feels bad that he brought him down.
But what was his situation again?
He's a Roman soldier.
The one I'm supposed to be defending is fixing to get killed, and I'm gonna be in serious trouble.
That's true, but what's at the heart of his dilemma, politically speaking?
Paul was a Roman.
That part of it. He still has a prisoner that he doesn't even have a charge against. This was yet another attempt by Lysias to get a charge against Paul. He's already quit holding him as a prisoner, but he's got to have a charge so that he can continue to do that, so that he knows how to proceed. Because, like I said, it may be that the charge requires him to step back and let Jewish law take place, or it may be that he has to continue to protect Paul's life. And so this was another one of his plans to get a charge, and it's turned out just the way the other did. Do you realize that in 2 days he's now had 3 riots?
Yeah, Rome's gonna get up.
Probably had not had any riots before this in his time in Jerusalem, and now in 2 days he's had 3 riots. It's not looking good on the old official record.
Here's a dilemma for me. Paul is a Roman. He's a Roman citizen, and Lysias knows that. He's turned them over to the Sanhedrin saying, hey, you judge this man, you do with him what you want to do. But if they had killed him,
They would have blamed the,
wouldn't let listen.
Oh, yes.
Lysias would have been, he would not have been out of jeopardy. He's still been in real serious.
Still carry responsibility. Because remember, the Jews can execute the death sentence without Roman approval. How do you think Paul feels at this moment?
Not knowing what's gonna happen.
he was probably,
Don't you think he is getting accustomed, finally, to the fact that he is not going to make any headway in Jerusalem? It's the dearest thing to his heart. Read those passages in Romans again. It's the dearest thing emotionally to him is the damnation of his own nation. And it has been his strongest belief that he was the answer to converting Jews to Christianity. Because, as we've said before, there is no logical defense of Paul's switch unless he genuinely had that experience with Jesus, etc. But again, you're not dealing with logic. You're dealing with emotions. And so you get this kind of result. We're almost out of time. Let's look at the first part of that statement. For the Sadducees, this is some historical statements from Josephus about the Sadducee Pharisee situation. The Sadducees take away the belief of the immortal duration of the soul and the punishment and the rewards in Hades. The doctrine of the Sadducees is this: that the soul dies with the body. And we'll close on the note that I put in here for two reasons. One, because it's true, but two, because we got to get to know this guy well in the book of Daniel. And that is Antiochus Epiphanes that we mentioned before. But remember that the reason why the earlier rebellion of the Jews had taken place was Antiochus Epiphanes becoming the head of that state. They're coming into his power, and his attempt to obliterate Judaism. He was the one that went into the temple and desecrated it, had the pig offered and all of these things. He was the one that had ordered all copies of the scriptures to be burned, and that had made it a penalty of death if you circumcised your child, and all of those things. The Sadducees came out of that period. A lot of people don't ever realize that. The Sadducees came out. They were the ones who wanted to embrace what Rome brought, you see, and that carried a necessity then to ease your conscience, to resolve cognitive dissonance in your conscience. If you were a Jew and you turned around and supported this Hellenistic move that you all become in word and deed Greeks, you know, then the only thing you could do is deny those doctrines that talk about anything other than this world. And so that's the foundation that came out of that. But, Lord willing, next week we'll take up there with verse 11.